All right, I think we're ready to get underway. Thank you to all of you who are joining us today, and welcome to the NCORE Connect and Explore webinar. We have a great panel today for you. We're going to be talking, of course, in our spotlight about introducing a toolkit for evaluating childhood healthy weight programs. We will have an opportunity at the end of our program for Q&A with our panelists, and then a few announcements for you at the end, and we'll get you out of here on time this afternoon. So thank you again for joining us. I want to introduce to you now our group of panelists and let you know who you'll be hearing from today. We have Brooke Belay, who is a medical officer with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We also have Ihuma Ineli, who is a professor of pediatrics at The Ohio State University, and she is director there of the Center for Healthy Weight and Nutrition and is affiliated with Nationwide Children's Hospital. We also have Nancy Sherwood, who is an associate professor with the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. We have Sandra Hassink, who is medical director of the American Academy of Pediatrics Institute for Healthy Childhood Weight. And finally, Matthew Levy, who is chief of the section of General and Community Pediatrics at the Medical College of Wisconsin. So a really great panel for you today. Let me mention right now, if you need technical assistance at any point during the webinar, or if you have a question for our speakers, we encourage you to type your questions in by clicking the Q&A icon that is located at the bottom of your screen. And someone will, if you have a technical question, someone will respond to you as quickly as possible. If you have a question for our speakers today, we will get to those during the Q&A session at the end of all of the presentations. If you have any trouble logging in to the webinar, if you get bumped out, please email us at ncore@fhi360.org and we'll work with you to resolve that problem. We will only be answering questions that are in the Q&A box, by the way, so please do put your questions in there rather than in the chat. So find that at the bottom of your screen right now where it says Q&A. I also want to invite you, if you'd like to join the conversation on social media, to use the hashtag ConnectExplore, and you can follow us at NCORE on Twitter. So with that, we want to kick things off today with a quick poll for all of you. We'd like to know a couple of things about you to help guide our panelists and what they're talking about. So first question for you is, prior to today's webinar, were you actually aware of a toolkit for evaluating childhood healthy weight programs as a resource? So yes or no for that. And second question, how would you describe yourself? Are you a practitioner, a researcher, a student, or something else? So please go ahead and answer those questions on the screen for you right now, and we'll give everyone just a moment to do that, and then after that we'll show you the results of this poll so you'll have an idea of who else is on the webinar as well. So giving everybody just a moment to answer those and sort of counting down with a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and hopefully everyone has had a chance to answer. So let's see the results of that poll. Okay, so this is, it's great news to us that a lot of people who were previously unfamiliar with this toolkit are going to find out about it today. So that's great. It looks like about 72% of the folks on the phone had not heard of the toolkit resource before now. So you'll know all about it by the end of today's webinar. And it looks like we have a mix of backgrounds and experience levels on the call today. So about 23% practitioners or researchers, almost 40% of you would consider yourselves researchers, almost 10% of the audience is students. And then we have a large group of folks who have other roles that involve this topic. So that's a great mix of backgrounds, and we hope that all of you will find something of value today that you can use this toolkit for going forward. All right, well, with that, I believe we are ready to get into our program. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Belay to kick things off.
Thank you. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brooke Belay, and I'm a medical officer with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I'm happy to be a part of this NCORE Connect and Explore webinar today, discussing this toolkit for the evaluation of childhood healthy weight programs, particularly in the community, but really generalizable to all venues. Throughout this program, we'll use those terms interchangeably: community healthy weight programs or just healthy weight programs. I'd also like to thank all of the experts who are part of the development of this toolkit. We obviously could not invite everyone to be on this webinar, but we do wish to acknowledge them. And I'd also like to thank my fellow presenters on this webinar today. Next slide, please. So this toolkit for the evaluation of childhood healthy weight programs includes the following sections: program evaluation overview, evaluation readiness, process and outcome measures, contextual factors, program sustainability, and remote evaluation of healthy weight programs. I'll be presenting on the evaluation overview, and my co-presenters will be covering the bulk of the rest of these topics today. Next slide, please. Also included in this toolkit is a library that can search for and collate all of the resources and guides that are mentioned throughout the toolkit. Next slide, please. For the purposes of this toolkit, we define evaluation as the systematic collection of data and information on the activities, characteristics, and outcomes of healthy weight programs to better understand how or why a program is effective or not, and to also help inform decisions about future program development. Next slide, please. We understand and promote the concept that evaluation is a continuous cycle that involves planning for actions, guides, and objectives, and measuring our performance, all with the goal of understanding why we are doing well or poorly, as the case might be. Next slide, please. So why evaluate programs? Well, all of us, including those of us involved on the ground in healthy weight programs, have a standing commitment for data-driven decision-making, and we're all responsible stewards for the funds with which we've been entrusted. And so we need to do our best to identify those strategies and investments that work best in our programs, and to see how we can sustain them and optimize them in the long term. Therefore, the goal of this healthy weight program evaluation toolkit is to increase the use of evaluation data for continuous program improvement. Next slide, please. Our goal ultimately is that this toolkit will enable the long-term evaluation of any single program, and that it would also increase our understanding of how different programs work and achieve similar outcomes, or not, of course. And finally, it's possible we can use this toolkit in the long term to help compare outcomes across different programs. Next slide, please. So the toolkit also assists individual programs in thinking about where they are in evaluation based on their own sort of evolution, if you will. So for example, programs that might be early on in their thinking about not just their program, but how they will evaluate their program, might think about more formative type of evaluations, including need assessments to understand priority areas that they might need to address. Furthermore, we include in the toolkit a discussion about the pros and cons of the use of either implicit or explicit logic models that can help guide a program's thinking about evaluation, and also, of course, their engagement with stakeholders. Finally, programs that are further along in their development and their thinking about evaluation might consider more summative type of evaluations that involve perhaps a longer and varied list of process and outcome measures that they'd like to address. Throughout this toolkit, we make a point of providing a tiered set of strategies, process, and outcome measures that a program can consider incorporating to their evaluation, once again, based on where they are in their development and growth from an evaluation perspective. Next slide, please. So in summary, this toolkit assists healthy weight programs in understanding the context of evaluation, the need for a varied partner and stakeholder engagement process, the goals and objectives of evaluation, and understanding what to measure and how to measure it. Next slide, please. This toolkit also helps us to identify specific questions to gauge program progress and impact, as well as the direction that implementation is taking. I'll now pass the presentation on to Dr. Nelly to discuss program readiness.
Thank you, Dr. Belay. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are all familiar with program evaluation, maybe not all the details, but we know about program evaluation, but perhaps not as much with evaluation readiness. So that's what I will cover. Evaluation readiness is that process of assessing whether a program or an organization has the ability to evaluate how well a program was implemented, how successful that program is, and what factors were responsible for its degree of success or failure. Next slide. So to start, there are a number of components to consider. You have to look at leadership support, organizational readiness and culture, and evaluation expertise and available resources. With organizational readiness, an important aspect is the work culture and the attitudes towards evaluation. In some organizations, it can be viewed negatively, more as a process that leads to finger pointing and reduced morale in the team. Other organizations, on the other hand, create a safe environment where evaluation is an opportunity to affirm and celebrate success and assess ways that you can enhance the program. And that is the goal in the toolkit when we look at childhood healthy weight programs. What is most important is that all interested parties are on the same page about both the purpose and the goals of the evaluation. And when we think about evaluation, we also have to consider program sustainability. Next slide. A good starting point in building a childhood healthy weight program, right, is to make sure that your purpose of the program aligns with that of the organization. And one way to determine that is to look at the mission and the vision. Depending on the size of the program, you may not have a mission or a vision itself. So it's important to find an organization's mission and vision that provides that anchor for you. Mission statements, like we all know, right, define why a program exists while helping to guide decisions about priorities, actions, responsibilities. A vision is that clear and aspirational statement of what your program wants to accomplish. So we all know that obesity is a tough and crafty condition. It's important to have a vision, and I encourage you to have a very lofty one because there's a lot of work to be done. Why are the mission and vision of an organization important? Because it drives the strategic plan. And we all know that the strategic plan determines where an organization places its resources, the people, the money, the facilities, all the things you need for a healthy weight program. So in the toolkit, we've added 4 resources. Next slide. And I encourage you to check them out. These can be helpful when you look at evaluation readiness. You're assessing timing or feasibility or in the planning of a program to make sure that all the elements exist for it to be ready for an evaluation. We all know that evaluations are expensive and time-consuming. You may want to conduct an evaluability assessment, an EA first, so you are sure that your evaluation will be feasible. And more importantly, it will yield useful information and you're conducting it at the right time. Next slide. So it can also help you identify upstream as you begin to plan your program, what may improve the odds of the program being ready for evaluation. So the EA is a systemic process. It's a common definition is that it's the extent to which an activity or project can be evaluated in a reliable and credible fashion. So the key is the reliable and credible fashion, which is where you get the systematic process. When you conduct an EA, it tells you, the evaluator, whether there are things in the program that are missing that will make the evaluation not useful. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them. One is the program design. When you look at the program design, you're looking at the model that supports that program. It's the theoretical basis and the quality assurance in that program, right? It's the model being formed by the top 3 donors to the organization, or is it steeped in evidence? So those are 2 key, and actually the first questions that should be asked when you look at evaluation. And then of course, when you have to look at your program implementation, that's where you talk about process and outcome measures, and you'll hear more about that today. Is the intended audience truly the one that the program is serving? Is a program for 10 to 17-year-olds serving 5 to 8-year-olds? Because in that evaluation, your results are not going to represent what the program goals are. And it's the same thing for the planned resources or the process in which the program was implemented. More importantly, you have to look at the data. So are we collecting the right data that fits the process measures or the outcomes that have been listed? The last thing that I will raise is the timing of the evaluation. When do you do it, early or late? Dr. Belay talked a little bit about that. Next slide. And an excellent tool that can be used both early and late, but it's actually fabulous if you're looking at it for early evaluation, is the Hexagon exploration tool that comes from Chapel Hill. And what it tries to do is it looks at the fit and feasibility of a program, or when you are moving it into a new setting, or you're moving it into a new practice. So translating a community program into a clinical setting, for instance. And like I said, it's most commonly used in the exploration stages, right? There are 6 indicator tools. And when you look at the tool guide, again, it's in the toolkit, it will lead you through a range of questions that will guide the process. Next slide. So in summary, in determining your evaluation readiness of your organization or your program, remember that it is an ongoing process. There are multiple things to consider, one being the readiness of your parent organization. The second is the structural and usable aspects that exist within your program. So the staffing, the training, the financial and capital resources. And then like we talked about earlier on, the data that you're collecting. What are the process measures that you've selected when you were developing the program, or your outcome measures? And always pay attention to the local drivers in looking at evaluation readiness. What's the perception of the community where you have your program? Next slide. So there are 2 case studies. I will not go through them because they're very nicely outlined in the toolkit. But these 2 case studies tell you the different processes. Check out the papers, the different processes that were used to build out these programs, and more importantly, where there were some concerns or challenges. Next slide. So now I'll hand over for our interactive poll.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have another poll question for all of you who are in the audience and would love for you to answer on the screen. The question is, are you currently running a childhood healthy weight program, or do you plan to in the future? So if you could tell us what the context is, if it's a yes, or if it's a no, not yet, that's fine. So yes, are you in a health system setting? Yes, are you in a community-based organization setting? Yes. Is it a federally qualified health center? Yes. Is it in some other setting that has not been listed here? Or is this something that you're not doing at this point yet? So let's give everybody a moment to answer here. And we'll just count down again. 3, 2, 1, and then we can show you the results of the poll. All right, fantastic. So we can see that, that a lot of folks on the call are not at the point of running a program like this, but maybe in the future. And then the rest of you, we have a variety of settings that your programs are in. So that's very good information for our panelists to know and to tailor what they're going to say next. I want to go ahead and hand things to our next speaker now to continue on with the presentation, and that is Dr. Sherwood.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And I really do like the fact that we have those survey questions, because it is nice to get even just a little bit of information about who we're talking to today. So talking a little bit about more in depth about process measures, which have been alluded to. Can you go to the next slide? So as we've talked about already, process measures are one piece of the puzzle in really trying to help us understand how our programs are being delivered, and how children and families are receiving them. And even who is getting into and engaged in our program, right from the start. There are two really main ways of categorizing process measures. We can categorize the process measures from the sort of the program and participant side, and process measures that focus more on the providers or the interventionists who deliver the program. And both are important for understanding what's happening and identifying targets for change. One of the things we know is that doing all of this can be difficult. Tracking these things can be difficult. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with the toolkit, and I'll talk about a little bit, is like, how do you sort of set it up so that you're able to build the process measures in a way that's going to be feasible so that they can be most useful. And there's, process measures, as again, has been mentioned a little bit, are useful in a variety of ways. One, just even being able to show at the end of your program what the attendance was, for example, or what the uptake was, is an important outcome in and of itself. But even importantly, probably just as important, is that, as you're going along the way, if you're able to use the process measures that you're collecting to be able to make changes and try different things to increase attendance, for example, that's another really good use of it. And Dr. Belay talked about that a bit in sort of that continuous process improvement cycle. So next slide, please. So program-based process measures. As I mentioned, one of the key factors for programs in community-based settings, healthcare settings, whatever the setting is the recruitment and engagement in starting the program in the first place. So I think it's really useful to be able to understand this, to track things like what is kind of the whole denominator that you've reached in terms of like interest in the program, which could include things like how many phone call inquiries have you had, online registrations, referrals, et cetera. And of those people who've expressed interest, another metric that's important is what % of the interested families enroll in the program. And sort of moving further down in my it's like almost like a triangle kind of upside down pyramid, that enrollment doesn't necessarily mean that kids or families are going to stay engaged in the program. So we also need to be thinking about tracking attendance in the program. What is a proportion of the children and families in the program who complete all or even most of the program? Because maybe completing every single session isn't realistic. But what being able to really understand that attendance and what is the dose of the program that your families are getting. One of the things too, by doing this close tracking, you could try to do, if say your attendance is flagging, if you're monitoring it, you could try different strategies and see, does that make a change in the trajectory of attendance? We also, in program-based process measures, want to know more about, what's actually happening in the program. So what this can include, what are the, topics being covered? If there's homework, for example, between the sessions, what % of participants are completing it? And also we want to know, in order to potentially make changes, what is the satisfaction with the overall program or specific programs or activities. Some things are inevitably going to be more popular and engaging, and it's important to be able to keep track of that and modify in the future. So, questions to consider is where do those numbers drop off, and what does that tell you about what changes you might want to make? What are the factors, if you are having lower enrollment or participation numbers, what are the barriers that could be leading to that? And again, where could you target for change to both increase engagement and re-engagement? Next slide, please. So this slide talks about provider-based process measures. So it's not just, we're wanting to see what's happening with our participants, but we're also wanting to understand how is the program being delivered as it's intended. Dr. Anelli talked a lot about kind of your framework for program and what are ways you can be monitoring your program as it's unfolding to check whether it's being delivered to fidelity. We can think about on the side of provider or interventionist training, what is happening there? What kinds of training sessions are provided? What are providers receiving? That the training, is it well received? Are they learning what they should learn? So that's on the one side of it. And then how are providers implementing the program as it's going on? This is where you can get really sort of more simple feedback from parents that are about satisfaction or their perception, or super detailed. And there's resources we have on the toolkit for that. And again, we're thinking about how could our training or ongoing supervision be enhanced? Next slide, please. And so this slide includes some factors in decision making. And one of the things that we've talked about in terms of program readiness is considering the perspective of partners and community members. So that is a really helpful process to go through to identify what are the most important things to collect. And again, that questions of what is realistic for us to collect, and how can we build it in so that sort of that collection of data, it just sort of happens more easily and can be the most useful. And then last is a list of some of the key factors that I've mentioned in terms of what we recommend for process measures, from that starting with that number of requests down to what is the level of engagement in the program. Thank you.
So now we'll go on to talk about outcome measures and contextual factors. Next slide, please. So choosing your outcome measures can be one of the most important decisions you will make. And as you saw from Dr. Belay's initial slide, that this may have to do with what stage your program is in, and you may be in a more mature program, or maybe you've measured some of your process measures and now you're ready to measure outcome measures. And as Dr. Anelli said, having a mission and vision is very important, and outcome measures should be consistent with what your program is designed to accomplish and should match your definition of program success. And of course, there are many parameters of success for your participants, families, partners, funders, and staff. And in designing your outcome measures, you want to consider your program size, duration, intensity, and the number of times you need to perform the measure. And you might want to be considering immediate outcomes, such as changes in dietary intake and physical activity, in addition to more long-term outcomes, such as changes in BMI. Next slide. You can't measure everything, and it's very tempting to want to do that, but you want to try to balance the feasibility and validity of your chosen outcome measures. And feasibility really is answering the questions for the measure. Can you technically perform the measure you want to use? Can you afford to perform the measure? Do you have the staff to perform and analyze the measure? And can you logistically schedule the space and time to perform the measure? And validity answers the question, is the measure well-founded? And does it correspond accurately to the real world? So you want to be measuring things that have meaning to yourselves, to the program participants, your patients, your providers. And does the measurement tool that you're using measure what it says it's going to measure? Next slide. So an example of things to consider when simply measuring height and weight, which is a pretty basic measurement. Are your staff trained so you can have consistency of the measurement? Do you have the right equipment, and can you afford the right equipment? Do you have time to conduct the measurements? How often do you want to be conducting the measurements? Do you have a private space where you can measure the weight and height of your patients? The acceptability of the measurements to the patients and staff, and considerations when measuring children who have severe obesity or disabilities. If they are part of your program, how are you going to do that? And so in the toolkit are guides to methods for assessing childhood obesity for your reference. Next slide, please. There are many types of outcome measures. As we just mentioned, height and weight are anthropometric measurements. You might want to measure physiologic or metabolic factors such as blood pressure, lipids, glucose, or hemoglobin A1C. You can measure effort-based measures, resting heart rate or heart rate recovery from exercise, or measures of fitness, strength, or motor skill development. And remember, these measures need to fit the mission of your program and the feasibility and validity that we talked about before. You might want to measure lifestyle or behavioral change measures, what changed in the patient's or child's nutrition, physical activity, screen time, or sleep, or psychosocial measures, health-related quality of life, self-esteem, weight-related teasing, depression, anxiety, and concerns about weight, shape, or body image. Just a point on this, if you will be measuring something like depression, you're going to need a plan for what happens if you find that a patient is depressed. So measurement has implications for taking care of the participants in your program. You might want to measure patient satisfaction or cost. And we often forget to measure cost, but understanding the cost of your program, how much does it cost to deliver the intervention? My facilitator or coach time and my space if I have to rent space, cost to the participants. These cost measures can make or break your program, and it's often worth considering measuring those as part of your outcomes. Next slide. Next, we'll go on to contextual factors, and these are factors which can have an impact on your program's outcomes, but are not necessarily part of your intervention. They may be specific to your program, to your participants and their families, or to the communities where your participants live. And contextual factors for childhood obesity can be quite complex and really encompass all the individual societal and systemic factors that impact a child's weight. So while you might have a very finely focused program that's working very hard on your child's lifestyle, other factors such as food insecurity, what's happening in the school, what's happening in the neighborhood, can be operating and really muddying the waters in terms of what results your program might be able to get. You might want to prioritize one or two contextual factors that you might be able to address and determine the best time in the program to ask these questions. So while there are many, many contextual factors, if you feel that there are a couple of factors that may directly impact the outcomes of your program, you may actually want to address these, measure these, and see if you can alleviate them. Ultimately, your goal is to assess potentially malleable contextual factors that your program may be able to address. Next slide, please. There may be barriers to attendance, conflicting schedules, parent attendance, parent engagement and behavioral change, conflicting commitments, hesitancy to attend because of prior unsuccessful weight loss attempts, contextual factors regarding transportation, need for reimbursement, inadequate transportation. Next slide, please. There may be scheduling factors. You may find that you need to offer the program session scheduling far in advance, tell people what it's going to be. You may want to map the frequency and duration of program onto the academic year instead of the summer. You may have to manipulate the location to make it more convenient or provide transportation assistance, deliver it virtually, including phone, text, and other modalities. Next slide. Structure of the program, whether it's group-based or smaller groups, whether it includes the whole families, can influence the effectiveness of the program, and whether you're offering incentives, a motivational program leader, fun and cultural relevance can all affect the outcome of your program. Next slide, please. You might want to understand readiness to change on the individual level, the demographic characteristics of your participants, and other health-related social needs that might affect their participants' ability to implement the program, such as housing instability, food insecurity, transportation, and so forth. Next slide, please. Mental health, adverse childhood experiences, again, all operate at the individual level. That can have an impact on your program success. You might want to understand the social connection with group leaders and coaches as being important to the success of your program, and alignment of program expectations and what technology you're using. Next slide, please. And barriers to healthy food and exercise, which you can see here. Next slide, please. So think about factors that are most important to your program and determine which ones you can do something about. Prioritize one or two that you might be successful at alleviating. Next slide, please. And now we'll go on to sustainability for healthy weight programs.
Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in this today. Next slide, please. Today I'm going to talk about sustainability of healthy weight programs. Sustainability is not a one-size-fits-all. Every organization is unique and at a different place in their journey. And as we saw from the poll, you are really at different places in your journey. And each organization has its own culture, characteristics, and strengths. So you may just be looking to start, or you may be looking to enhance your services. But sustainability is really about your future, but it starts in the present. So how you create this is critically important. Today, I'll touch very briefly on some of the ideas. I won't go into detail on everything. It's all in the toolkit, so I encourage you to use the toolkit. There are numerous definitions of sustainability. According to SAMHSA, this definition, it's maintaining and continuing program services after the funding period is over and ensuring the organization has become a permanent part of the community resources and the community partnerships. CDC defines it a little differently, and they focus a little bit more on the community side of it, and the ongoing capacity and resolve to work together to establish and advance strategies that improve quality of life and health. Shell described it in a little bit more formal capacity, and it's the sustainability capacity is really the existence of the structures and the processes that allow a program to leverage the resources to effectively implement and maintain evidence-based policies and activities. To me, this is the most succinct definition. But the broader idea here is that sustainability is really when programs secure their longevity to be able to address the issues for which they are designed to address. Next slide, please. To do that, there needs to be certain elements in place and active. Wellen described 10 elements related to sustainability. Planning is critical, and it must include certain other elements. Gathering evidence for your program, which you've heard a lot about already. Finding a program champions. It's important to have somebody to be able to push this and drive this forward. Seek and then use that and push it forward and seek commitments and support from both internal, organizational, and external stakeholders. Continue to develop and foster those partnerships, which then lead to building capacity, both again, internal and external, and also looking at how the staying current with the policies that are happening both around you and in your community, and which affect you and may affect how you promote your program. And of course, always evolving and adapting in the current environment is important. And the last point is garnering funding. Funding, of course, is always front and center for sustainability of a program. Next slide, please. This is a great tool. The program sustainability assessment tool was developed at Washington University in St. Louis. It's a 40-item self-assessment program I urge you to use. You can take this to evaluate the sustainability capacity of your program. You take it online, it'll give you an automatic report, and you can use this report to create a sustainability plan. Next slide, please. This tool breaks the plan into 8 domains. Each one of these domains should have at least one goal attached to it, preferably a SMART goal, as many of us know. These domains are strategic planning, environmental support, communication, funding stability, partnerships, organizational capacity, program evaluation, and program adaptation. And as you can see, they're very similar to the previous slide. So there's a lot of common themes here. I'm only going to touch on 4 of these today, and more, as I said, more information is in the toolkit. Next slide, please. So the strategic plan is really the glue that holds the sustainability effort together. Without a strategic direction, a mission, as you heard earlier at the beginning, and long-term goals, the programs have no clear path. So spend a lot of extra time putting together your sustainability and your strategic plan, because it combines elements of all the other sustainable domains into an outcome-oriented plan. However, this needs to be done in conjunction with your organization. It won't serve you well if you march in one direction and your organization is marching in another direction. You won't find the support you need. Your strategic plan should also outline who is doing what roles and responsibilities there are, your fiscal needs, and when you're doing the regular assessments, and what kind of evaluation you are doing, process and outcome, and whether you're ready to do that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, your strategic plan should also align with your organizational plan. With this alignment, you are more likely to garner the organizational support, but also you need to assess the organization's capacity to by identifying shared staff and resources, workforce and technology, systems such as purchasing and grant writing talents, marketing, legal, HR. This both reduces your need for additional funding to support these intermittent services, and also continues to keep you connected and front and center of those who support your mission. Some organizations do charge a user fee, and some provide it in kind. Next slide, please. So funding stability is establishing a stable funding base. I cannot stress enough that planning for financial sustainability is critically important. Look at diversifying your portfolio. Don't rely on one source only. A lot of programs, it's estimated that 40% of all programs do not last beyond the first few years after the initial funding ends. But if you have achieved your mission in 2-3 year cycles, you're more likely to be strong. Look at funding, both locally, federal, state, reimbursement, individuals, fundraisers, and of course, look at research as a possible interest. Next slide, please. As you can see here, institutional support is the most common revenue stream, followed by clinical revenue, grants, foundations, and endowments. I would urge you to go to your institution because outside funders like to see that organizations have skin in the game. They want to know that you're committing, and it can't just be in-kind support. Next slide, please. The last domain I'll touch on is communication, and create an excellent communication plan, both getting information to your internal partners and your stakeholders. This is how you tell people what you're doing and let them know that your successes. Next slide, please. The slides I talked about before were mostly just about general programs, but this is more specific to obesity prevention programs. I'm not going to go into the details here for time, but really they focus on economic strength, as we talked about, social responsibility, which centers around community assets and community partnerships, and environmental stewardship of the continuum from internally with wellness programs to externally with partnerships and around finding appropriate places to create programs. Last slide. So the changing landscape for nonprofit, the landscape is changing for nonprofits. Outcomes really overshadow outputs. While people appreciate your work, they invest in your impact. So organizations are now looking at investment and community investment, which has replaced just giving and charity. Doing good is not always good enough, and try to look at ways to look at outcomes and return on investment. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. So just a quick word on remote evaluation. So while this toolkit is not focused on the delivery modality of community healthy weight programs, we do share guidance on the remote evaluation of programs, regardless of how they're delivered. We will very briefly discuss some of these strategies and their workaround solutions, along with their relative strengths and weaknesses on the upcoming slide. It's important to note that many of these strategies are becoming increasingly feasible, and so as they change, we'll be sure to update our toolkit online accordingly. So how can one conduct a virtual or remote program evaluation? Data collection can come from a number of sources, including, for example, well-child visits. By necessity, this requires some level of collaboration and partnership with primary care offices, and it's very promising. However, of course, there are emergent circumstances that need to be considered, and privacy and data integrity have to be respected as well. One can also gather evaluation data from outside venues that have been collected by trained staff. This, of course, requires some training and resource allocation up front, depending on the exact setting. Considerations such as weather and so forth have to be taken into consideration. As Dr. Hassing mentioned previously, once again, we have to think about privacy when it comes to these type of venues as well. Can the child and the family's privacy be maintained? Home measurement is another possibility for data collection for evaluation. These can include weight and height from the appropriate instruments that perhaps have been Bluetooth enabled, with or without remote assistance from a telehealth type of visit. Once again, there's a training and cost and a resource consideration that comes into play here as well. Finally, perhaps more feasible, but perhaps the validity of some of these measures might drop, are self-reported measurements. So these can be conducted using standardized tools and equipments where families kind of send in their data, of course. Once again, feasibility goes up, but we have to carefully think about how reliable these data are. So with that said, I'll close out the remote evaluation consideration piece here. There's a lot more in our toolkit, and thank you.
All right, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, but we know also a lot of information was provided here. And so I know that for many of you, you're going to need to take a look at the toolkit and sort of unpack it on your own to get the full meaning of some of the detail that was covered here. We know it was a lot, but we would like to open it up we have time for one or two very quick questions today. We're a little short on time. I want to answer a couple of questions that have been mentioned already. First, we will be providing a recording of the webinar, and so you can look for that. You'll be receiving an email. Also, in your chat, you should see the URL for the toolkit, so you can find that. A couple of folks had asked questions about where they could find that toolkit. We invite you to put in any other questions that you might have at this moment. I want to mention, we have one question here. We had one question in the chat related to health equity and NCORE, and it's a bit of a complex question, but we wanted to say that NCORE is very much addressing the consideration of health equity in its work going forward. And it's something that we would like to address in more detail, perhaps in a future webinar, since we're so short on time today. So a couple of other questions that we have here. We had one question about in the toolkit, how are there resources for how to get the best health demographics from your state or county? And I invite you to put your questions in the Q&A, please, rather than the chat. We've got about 2 minutes left. So does anybody want to address that question on how to get the best health demographics from your state or county?
So in the section, this is Inelli, in the section on evaluation readiness, the toolkit has a link that allows you to go in and use that link and search for your state and county for some of that information. Of course, also looking at the CDC website will be a good place to go.
Okay, excellent. Time for maybe one more very quick question, if we have any from the audience. Again, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. And another good question, I will read it. I don't know if we'll have time to address it totally. How can we address the current fat shaming and fat phobia situations when designing studies that have to do with height and weight of children, and particularly continuing to measure BMI? So any quick response on that?
Well, I think that you have to respect the patient's privacy and train the staff well when you're taking height and weight measurements. It should be done privately without comment. Sometimes in clinical situations, we measure the height and weight and don't ask the patient if they'd like to know it or not. We may measure it and know it. The patient may not at that time want to know it. So you have to be very sensitive to how this is done. That said, height and weight measurements can be critical when you're monitoring the health of a participant and the outcomes. So you just have to be sensitive. And I would say train the staff well of how to do this sensitively.
Okay, excellent. Any other follow-ups on that? All right, well, we promised at the beginning that we would get everyone out of here on time. So I want to be mindful of that. I'm sorry, did I cut someone off just then?
No, I just couldn't do more than the second Dr. Hastings' comment that, that privacy, that respect and sensitivity always have to be forefront in our discussions and how we interact with others.
Yeah, so yes, thank you for that. And it's definitely, that is a concern I know that has been raised in the past. So thank you for addressing those issues. I think that is all the Q&A we have time for, because we're very, very close to the end here. So I have a couple quick announcements I want to mention before we break. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists today. This was a great introduction to the toolkit. Hopefully people can unpack it further on their own, but thank you again for your time today and for your work in putting together the toolkit and making all of these resources possible. A couple of quick announcements for everyone in the audience. We want to encourage you, if you are a student, to sign up for the NCORE student newsletter, and you can see the URL on the page or on the screen right now for that. And do be sure to check out our student hub, where you will find lots of good materials as well. In addition to that, if you have used any of NCORE's tools, we would really like to know about it. So please contact us at ncore@fhi360.org and let us know what tools you're using, how that's going, and we may feature you in one of our upcoming webinars if you'll let us know how you are using these tools and what we should be telling other people about them. If you have further questions after today's webinar, you can contact us also at ncore@fhi360.org. Any kinds of questions about upcoming activities, just please email the NCORE Coordinating Center and we will get back to you as soon as possible. In addition, I would ask that you mark your calendar for upcoming Connect and Explore webinars. The next one is going to be November 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be on the impacts of children's food and beverage advertising, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. So please do join us for that and go to our website to check out other upcoming topics and dates so that you can get those on your calendar. With that, we are done for today. So I want to thank you all again who joined us on the panel, and thank you to all of you who were in attendance. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you in November at our next webinar. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.